Vulnerability is the ability to really know myself and be willing to let my whole self be seen. And I think the only way to be an authentic leader is to be vulnerable.
Who doesn't want to be a great leader? A leader who's calm under pressure, insightful, respected, well-liked. But what does it take to become a great leader? Hey, I'm Boo, and welcome to my podcast. The Few Leadership Podcast defines great leadership and what great leadership looks like. And I've found some of the world's best leaders or experts in the field of leadership to help you accelerate your leadership journey so you can be an ace at the game of leadership. If you're ready to rethink everything you know about leadership, if you're excited about accelerating your leadership journey, let's strap in and ignite your leadership potential. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Few Leadership Podcast, the speaker series, and very excited about our guest here today, where we're going to be talking, predominantly about staying human. There's no doubt as we move into the automation and digital era, as we battle for attention, and you're constantly absorbed in technology, as well as the dislocation that we're still experiencing through COVID. And we definitely see it in our practice with Afterburner as well, is a loss of patience, frustration, that we're kind of losing some of these human skills. And my guest today, he really just is a specialist humanist. And I'm not going to give too much away now. I'd like to introduce Anne Robie to everyone on the podcast. Anne, thank you so much for freeing up the time to talk to all the aspiring and established leaders on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So Anne, before we get in your personal story, which is quite interesting, a lot of leaders out there are struggling at the moment. There's a lot of fear, given that many people in the middle to higher leadership roles are concerned about losing their job to a chatbot. What do you see as some of the predominant challenges and fears for leaders at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing a lot from my clients and from the folks that I work with. And as you sort of stated, there's a lot of fear kind of in the system right now. But, ultimately, I think anytime we have any sort of major revolution, new invention, the car was going to put out all of the farmers and the horses, and then the computer was going to put away anybody that put pen to paper on anything. And I don't mean to belittle this moment, but I think some of these fears that we're hearing, we're going to lose all of our jobs and it's never going to be the same, and are the robots going to take over? We're hearing this, we're seeing this, we see the movies. To me, it's exactly as you said, it's a bit of the fear of the unknown. And ultimately, I think humans struggle with that, right? Like, we want to be able to control our environments. We want to be able to see around corners and understand kind of what's coming down the path, if you will. And to the degree that folks can't see that, it's causing a lot of angst, if you will, in the system. To me, ultimately, however, it kind of comes back to exactly as you stated at the beginning, like, how can we be a little bit more human as we move into greater and greater reliance on computers, right? There will be a lot of things that AI, LLMs in general, will be able to do for us and take off of our plates. But what I try to encourage my clients, the folks I work with, the folks that kind of reach out to me because they have concerns, what I really try to reinforce to them is we all have to play in the space that we are already most excellent at. And frankly, all of us are put on this planet with a set of skills and things that nobody else in the whole world can actually do. And that doesn't mean we don't grow and reach and try to, continue to learn. But what it does mean is we can't, to the degree that we ever try to mold ourselves into somebody else's ideal or to somebody else's perspective of what it means to be a leader, or because there's some new hot whatever technology coming down the pike, that's when we start to get ourselves in trouble. And so what I try to encourage the folks I work with to do is to keep coming back to their true nature, to their soul, to who they are and the reasons they were put on this planet. And I think that when we can do that, we all win.
Is there truth to it, though? Is there truth to the general concept that we are becoming less competent at interacting, in that we are becoming so engaged with technology, and it's such a one-way conversation that we're starting to get a little dislocated with expectation. I mean, I've got teenage kids, particularly teenage daughter, who feels a little bit like, I just want a really safe, simple job where I don't have to deal with a lot of stuff because there's so much expectation out there, a lot of anxiety. Is this kind of a myth or a false perception that we're being dehumanized, or is it actually happening?
Well, I think to some degree, I saw some post this weekend that 80% of millennials would marry their chat GPT or something, right? Like,
come on.
But I think this is a of the moment thing, and I don't work with young people as much. And so you may actually have a better bird's eye view to that than me. But what I really think is it comes back to exactly like coming back into our humanity is even more important now. Right? Because could this take over? Could this make us more, disassociated from each other, frankly, from ourselves? It could. But ultimately, we can't have two LLMs having the kind of conversation that you and I are having right now, right? We can't have a ChatGPT sort of created avatar leading organizations or countries or places where we need sort of more of the human touch. We just can't, right? So can sort of these models take some things off our plate? They absolutely can. And perhaps to your point, we need to have some safeguards, just like we had to do with the dawn of the internet. It was a free for all at first, right? And so once we kind of figure out how to have some boundaries there, then I think it actually can be used to our benefit. The key is to not let it take over all of our social interactions or to rely on it for things that actually need the human touch. And so you asked, is it true? It can be, and I'm sure in pockets, and they'll tell you that 80% number certainly got my attention this past weekend. Yeah. It can be true, but I think it's on those of us that have been through a couple of iterations of different kinds of revolutions to sort of help and to guide and to use this thing as a tool and not as a end all be all for our personal relationships.
Yeah, I also read a study last year and it said that most people under the age of 30 prefer their online personality and persona rather than themselves, which is pretty scary, I guess. I mean, it's so easy to disappear. And I know in your practice, you're very much about the personal development as a leader as much as the leader skills of running a team. So if you look, I mean, I did an event a couple of weeks ago with a company that we've been working for many years. And one of the leaders came up to me and said, I've never been so anxious I've been in this company 22 years and never been so anxious. People are getting fired. And whereas we used to have this really collaborative, open culture here, and this is, probably, what is it? One of the 6 or 7 largest companies on the planet. All of a sudden, there's this expectation that I deliver results. And if I don't deliver results, I'm on a warning. And if I don't deliver results when I'm on a warning, I'm fired. And people are getting fired. There also seems to be a little bit of a shift around results-driven performance as well. Whether Doge doing what Doge does has kind of pushed the needle. Is that something that you're also seeing now, that there is a more of a, I guess, results-driven push within leaders than there used to? That like now that there's kind of less investment in DEI, there's less investment in the individual in the company, that there's a shift towards results?
It's interesting. I find it fascinating that somebody would think that it was a brand new idea that they had to deliver results.
Yeah,
and if they didn't,
me too, but not with this.
I mean, to me, spent 25 years in human resources, and that for all 25 years, that's been the basis of the work that we've done. That, I'd love to say that companies are in business, for very altruistic means, but let's be honest, they're not, right? Like they employ us to deliver results. And so I don't know that that is a new concept. And I also am not 100% sure. I think that organizations are changing the way that they talk about individual investment and DEI. And I think the strongest companies have continued to invest in the needs of the individual and in, I certainly make my personal decisions on where I spend money on those organizations that continue to value individuals and individual expression. I have a friend who she leads diversity at Microsoft. And, they had a discussion early on, she and the CEO, that sort of went something like, do we need to change your title? And she said, no, let them come for us first. Right. And so I think that the strongest companies are the ones that are continuing to invest. I don't think it's a shift that there's expectation that you deliver. I think that that is how business works. And, might there be less tolerance for things going a little bit slower? Possibly, right? But I think part of that is, again, how do we use the tools that are available to us in order to accelerate towards our future? I just had a coaching call this morning and somebody in the biotech arena, and she was struggling with how to engage with a potential future leader. And, we brainstormed some ideas. I'm like, hey, just throw it to ChatGPT. See what your ChatGPT can. And she was like, oh, I haven't even touched it yet. I'm like,
Yeah.
listen, you are missing out. Like
Yeah.
this is a huge thing. And I'm not saying let it do the thinking for you. What I am saying is you have some core ideas here, but you're kind of struggling with exactly how to say it. It's just like you're brainstorming with a friend. Throw it in there and sort of see what happens. And I think that that is what's missing. I'm not seeing a higher level of expectation in terms of delivery and performance. And, you referenced Doge. Frankly, that was an unbelievably, ridiculously blunt instrument. They weren't looking at who was performing and who wasn't performing. They just sort of came in and started chopping heads and scaring people, frankly. And so I think that that was a moment in time, and there'll be a massive backlash from that we just, we're recording this in June of 2025. We'll kind of see what happens. But my expectation is that they don't even know what they've cut off yet, right? Because they didn't bother to do exactly what your client at one of your customers sort of said, which was to actually look and see who was delivering. What is the ROI? What is the sort of impact that we can have by maintaining a particular program or investing in particular areas? And they came in stupidly bluntly, if I can be blunt, and talk about it. And the fact is they're doing exactly the opposite. If we could get back to actually looking at, was there some government fat? Absolutely. Is there an opportunity to do things in a smarter way? Hell yeah, there is. But can we do that in a smart way and not just with a flippin' chainsaw standing on a stage somewhere? I mean, ridiculousness.
Yeah, it's certainly an impactful way to make an impression on stage. That's for sure. I just want to go back to something you said right at the start. And there's two words that I feel are thrown around a lot in the leadership space, fear and courage, right? These words that, courage for one person is a very different paradigm to courage from another person. Yeah. And as you said, you've been an HR professional for many years. And to use your words, you're a pretty hard-nosed HR person for a long, long time there, and kind of decided at some point in your life to step back from that and open yourself up to vulnerability. I would like to frame those three points in one and get your insight on it. Fear, courage, and vulnerability. Because obviously to admit you're afraid is to be vulnerable and not something most people are comfortable with, because no one wants to say, I'm afraid. And, courage, because there's some narratives going around in the world right now that do require some courage
Yes.
in terms of not normalizing to what's around. So how do you frame up that triangle? How do you balance vulnerability, fear, and demonstrate courage when so much is changing around you?
Yeah. There's a magnet on my refrigerator that says, courage is feeling the fear, but doing it anyway. I think it was maybe John Wayne that said that. Don't quote me. But to me, fear and courage have this strong relationship, but I think vulnerability is slightly different, right? Because you can have fear and courage and still be holding a piece of yourself back. So to me, vulnerability is the willingness to let your whole self be seen. And it's a really interesting question right now, especially given what we were just talking about with cuts and all that. I have a speaking engagement here in a couple months where it's to an arts organization. And I speak a lot about authentic leadership. And I think the only way to be an authentic leader is to be vulnerable. And then your willingness and ability to be vulnerable then allows you a little bit more courage in the face of fear, if you will. But it's an interesting talk I have to give, and haven't figured it all out yet. But the fact is if somebody is an executive director or leader of an organization whose funding is under threat, if they don't sort of get in line and salute to the standard of the moment, how do you then be authentic? And to me, it is all about getting quiet, understanding what's important, standing my ground, and being able to articulate what is true for me, but also in a way that can be heard from my audience, right? So coming back to those leaders of an arts organization, it is Not that you have to shout from the rooftops and have the protest signs and all of that. Like if that's important to you, then sure, you do that. But in order to be both authentic and not jeopardize funding for your particular organization, it is still being true to who you are, but in a way that can be heard. And so to me, it starts with that vulnerability thing, realizing that there might be some fear of something in the system, or I might be under threat in some way, but having the courage to step forward with your authenticity, but just doing it in a way that can be heard. So I see them as separate and distinct, but you're laying out a really interesting way to think about the three of them together and how they connect.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly find, I don't now because I don't care, right? I've been around long enough to have seen everything and made enough dumb mistakes to realize it's just worth just saying I don't know sometimes as a leader. But I think my impression of people is we tend to take an extreme sample of everything, right? We say fear, we take an extreme sample of fear. We say vulnerability, we think that's just been a blubbering mess. And just, and we take courage and feeling like, right, I've just got to make a big decision and on top of everyone and have the courage to make the decision on behalf of everyone else without collaborating, right? I would kind of like for you to I had a similar experience to you. I was a hard nose. I was a tough cookie, right? And I was really successful and tough. And then everything else that was my personal life and a whole bunch of other stuff fell by the wayside. But I thought that was just part of being tough, right? And then realized, no, someone introduced me to vulnerability in my mid-30s. I'm like, that's what vulnerability is. But maybe you can give kind of some insight into some of the tough cookies out there that just feel like vulnerability doesn't have a place. And when you say that word, what are you meaning as a leader? What does that mean? How do you show up as a vulnerable leader?
Yeah. Well, you said a whole bunch in there, right? And so I think what's really important for folks to think about is that the playbook that got you to wherever you are now isn't the same playbook. And it is related to the first part of our discussion. And that is we have to become even more human as machines are doing some of the things that people used to do, right? And so to me, vulnerability is the ability to really know myself and be willing to let my whole self be seen. Now, you made a really important point about, vulnerability is the blubbering, sharing of all my stuff. That's not vulnerability. That's like therapy seeking, right?
Yeah.
Like that, there's something different in like just all my shit hanging out. That's a different need. Vulnerability is sort of the willingness to let my whole self be seen. So let me give you an example from my personal journey. And, that is I worked for a bunch of really great companies, frankly, surrounded by a lot of smart white men. And I sort of thought the way to be successful was to act like them. And it worked for a while, right? I was kind of tough. I took no bullshit. I sort of like led from shoot first, ask questions later. I mean, it's sort of it's a very testosterone fueled kind of way to get things done. The problem is that I was hiding a great part of who I actually was. So it's not that I woke up. It's more like I had that part of my life. And then I had I do a yoga teacher training on the side, but I would never bring in any of that, or the crystals you can't see in this video that are all sitting right here next to me, or the prayers that I send out with my divinity circle that I'm a part of with the women's group that I'm in, right? So to me, it is, and what was missing because of all of that is I was hiding half of who I was. And because of that, they only got half of my brilliance. And while it worked for a while because I was kind of playing the game in a way, like I got to a point where I had myself so tied up in knots trying to be something that I wasn't, that frankly, I failed, right? And I was fired from a job that was devastating to me. But when I think about it afterwards, I don't blame them. And I would have done the same damn thing. We had a discussion a moment ago about having expectations to deliver, and sure, was I minimally checking the boxes? I was, but what they wanted, they had hired this person that they thought would bring new insights, different ways of thinking about things, my particular spin on things. And what they got was a little cookie cutter. They got a mini me of something that I had decided long ago was how leaders should lead. And so when I say to leaders, we need more of who you are, It's not the blubbering idiot, like you said, and it's not the raging jerk either, but it is all of those tender bits that we often hide. Because here's what happens is that not only it's a little freeing, it's a little bit like being in the closet a bit, right? Like I'm hiding a part of who I am. And when I can come out, I can more freely express myself, but I'm also more free to bring my wild and crazy ideas, some of which are smart and some of which maybe should have stayed in the closet, but at least they get aired out, right? But I also, when leaders can also bring all of these parts of who they are, they're also shining a light and inviting others in with them. Meaning, not only do I get to show up in more of my brilliance and what I bring to the table, but I also invite you and those around us to do that as well. And then all of a sudden, all the boats are rising because we're a little bit more of who we are. Now, is this sometimes messy? Yeah. Sometimes it's a little bit messy, right? But the fact is, I would rather take a little bit messy and we figure out some boundaries so that people can fully express who they are without it sort of disrupting everything that we're trying to do. Again, it's not therapy. I'd rather deal with that, sort of the argument for, we'll go back to our discussion about diversity. It's a sort of the argument for diversity. I would rather have the diverse set of opinions and the diversity of a broad range of experience and all of the sum of that, which is harder to come to a conclusion. It is, but we get to a better conclusion than have everybody in the room nodding and just sort of kissing the ring. And then we get a least common denominator solution.
If you're enjoying the show, I'd just like to ask of you a little favor. We're on a mission here to ignite the world's leadership potential. We need to reach out to as many leaders as we possibly can. So if you're enjoying the show, I just ask you to leave a review, to subscribe, to help introduce this podcast to other leaders to join you on your journey to flawless leadership. We're going to head back to the episode now. I hope you've enjoyed what you've learned today. Please remember, let's ignite a movement of flawless leaders. Subscribe, leave a review. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I did a podcast the other day with a gentleman called Cam F. Awesome, who I don't know if you've met Cam, but he used to be the captain of the US boxing team for like 10 years. And he's got a whole practice on positive self-talk. And he found this quote, and it reads to what you're saying a little bit. And it really stuck with me. You know, he said it doesn't matter what you think of yourself, and it doesn't matter what other people think of you. It's what you think other people think of you is the problem, right? And I think when you because we're all worried, I think, to some degree. You know, as a speaker, you're worried about what you're going to say if it's connect. As a CEO, you're worried if someone understands what you said, or you're worried if you're out there on a tangent. I think one of the challenges, it seems, with leadership is that leaders are always moving in the future, right? They're leading people to a goal, a KPI, and there's always uncertainty because it hasn't happened yet. So
that's right.
You know, so is it true to say that when you open up that vulnerability and set that as a benchmark and avail that to your team, that all of a sudden you do start to build trust, you do start to build engagement, and people do start to feel included? To go back to your point before, because again, I'm paraphrasing you, I'm getting this wrong, just please correct me, but you kind of said, you know, and it's interesting, I podcasted another HR executive, it's kind of had the same journey. What would you have done differently? Like, is there specific things or ways of showing up you would have done differently as the hard-nosed HR exec now? And take the firing away, because I guess for everyone that has a story, you've got to have that experience, right? I mean,
sure.
You've got to have it. But were there some specific, I guess, moments in leading during those 20 years that you could share with the people listening where they might be doing it right now and just not even aware of it? Yeah.
Maybe I'll try to answer that by talking a little bit about what I do now that's a little bit differently, and then we can kind of back that in a little bit. So it was interesting. A year or so ago, I was invited to the board of directors for one of my clients. There was some issues with the senior team, and I was consulting and trying to help them, and the board had some questions. And I remember we were in Las Vegas at one of those gigantic hotels, and I was sitting outside of the room, and I saw one exec after another coming out, and they looked sort of grumpy, and they were sort of marching out. And I'm like, oh God, and I knew my discussion that I was going to have in the afternoon, which was only the CEO. The rest of the execs were going to be gone. So me, the CEO, and the board was going to be even tougher. And so I saw everybody a little bit grumpy. I caught the exec admin. I'm like, what's going on in there? She's like, it's not good. And so I get in the room, and I think my former self would have gotten very official very quickly and run through the data and the numbers and my observations. And these are the recommendations. I would have just jumped right to business. But I got in the room and I kind of felt the vibe. And this is where some of the more woo-woo nature of who I am I allowed it to come out. And I turned to the board chair and I said, kind of looks like you guys had a rough morning. And she said, oh, you have no idea. I'm like, yeah. And there's some, I knew about half the folks in the room, but the other half was kind of like, you're straight out of Wall Street, pointy shoes, pinstripe suits, watches more expensive than my first car type of situation, right? Like these guys looked ready for battle. So I turned to the board chair, and I said, why don't we do just a couple minutes of meditation and breathing to sort of reset so that we can have a more productive conversation this afternoon. Now, to be perfectly honest, I happen to know that she had been to Kripalu in the past, which is a meditation and retreat center in New York. And so it was a tiny gamble, but I thought I might have her in my corner if I made the suggestion. So it was a calculated gamble. And she said, yeah. I'm like, great. Everybody, please find your feet on the floor. Lift the crown of your head towards the sky.
How did everyone else find it there? I mean, if you were...
Well, it was funny, right? Because like she went immediately in, and her forefinger and her thumb touched, like she knew what I was talking about. And some of those pinstripe suit people were like, kind of, who is this California chick and where did she come from? But the honest truth is I would never have done that before. And it shifted the energy dramatically. Now, some of them probably didn't know the point, but I had them inhale and exhale to slow count for probably about a minute and a half. And even if you don't believe any of this stuff, the pure fact of getting more oxygen into your body, that changes your physiology and it changes some of the stuck bits, right? And so we had a far more productive conversation. But to your question, yeah, some of those dudes were like, what is happening? But whatever. We had a tough conversation in the afternoon. We had to make some tough decisions. But I have to believe, I wish I could have sliding doors so I could see what it would have been if we hadn't done that versus what we actually did do. But I kind of know in my heart of hearts, like it was a far more productive conversation. So that's an example where I would never have done that in the past. But that is truly a big part. I had this whole like woo-woo life, this whole meditation life, this whole yoga life. I'm a certified yoga teacher. I never told anybody about it, right? Like I had this whole other part of my life that I never brought into the corporate world. And the fact is that I was then playing small, right? Like I don't want to toot my own horn, but we shifted something that day for those people. And then we went on to dinner that evening and we had really interesting conversations about things like the Enneagram and how some new forms of, I'll call them plant medicines, are changing the way people think and approach things at work. And it's not that I'm out there beating my drum for that thing necessarily, but I think we opened up the conversation in a much more broad way. And we probably would have stuck to, ROI and, who should we fire had we not had the more in-depth, get quiet, change our physiology through some breathing. So it's a small example, but it is definitely something that I had left behind. I'm a pretty outspoken person. And I remember once I was in a kind of a training, and this was earlier in my career. So I was probably being even more cautious. And there was an opportunity for me to express myself, and it was welcomed and invited. And I just, wow. And I screamed. I kind of held up like a rocker chick sort of fingers or something. And a bunch of people afterwards were like, God, I just would have never thought that was who you were. And I'm like, oh my God, you have no idea. Because I was contained. I was playing in this little box I had created for myself. So to go back to your original question, the invitation for folks listening would be like, what parts of yourself are you leaving in the parking lot in the morning? Right? Like I do a lot of work with the Enneagram, and I was talking to a gentleman for a client meeting I have in a couple
just
weeks.
Kind of into the Enneagram a little bit, because I think for some people, that's kind of like a whole new concept, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. The short answer is the Enneagram is some of my Enneagram people hate me saying this, but it's basically a personality assessment. And you've probably heard of Myers-Briggs or DISC or some of these other ones. And I like the Enneagram because it describes not the what of what we do, but the why of what we do. And so you and I could take the exact same action on the same day and it could look very similar, but our motivation underlying that action is quite different. And what I think is so brilliant about this tool is it gets to our core why. But what it does when I bring it in, and so I have a team that I'm working with, that it facilitates deeper conversations and we get a little bit more into some of that core of who you are stuff, all the authenticity stuff that I love so much. And I was talking to this senior leader at an organization recently, and he started telling me about his woodworking. And then he pulled something off of his shelf and he's showing it to me on the Zoom. And he was very excited about woodworking. And I said to him, "Oh, have you shown any of this to your colleagues?" And he's like, no. This isn't work stuff. This is, and so I just, I invited him. I was like, well, I think it'd be kind of interesting if they knew about this interest. And then we got in this really interesting discussion about, well, what the hell does woodworking have to do with anything at work? So of course, like any good coach would, I turned it around on him. I'm like, I don't know. What do you think it has to do with anything at work? And he sort of sat back for a moment and he thought about it and he came up with a couple of big ideas. But this is what I'm saying. Like his shutting that off was shutting off a whole piece. His creativity was not coming forward at work because he just didn't think it was work stuff. Now, yet to be seen what impact that has. But because I got to work with him through the work of the Enneagram, he brought it out and he was willing to share it with me. And I'm hoping he's now willing to share it with some colleagues as well. But the Enneagram, I'll just finish off on that since you asked. But the Enneagram is a fabulous tool to help. I was just with some folks in Wisconsin last week, and I had a workshop for about 80 people. And I mean, there were tears, there were hugs, there were like, oh my God, I had no idea. People felt seen. I dropped people into groups. So they're similar to each other. And so much of what the Enneagram helps us unfold is the things that we try to hide away a little bit. And so it brings it forward. And I heard so many things like, you too? Oh my God, I thought that was just me. Right. And so it's this beautiful tool that allows people to explore for themselves and see their colleagues. And ultimately, I call it an empathy building tool.
Maybe be a little bit vulnerable.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
It's, it's fascinating. In every word in the English language, there's nuance, isn't there?
Mm.
And one of the nuanced words that I think requires exploration for corporates is that concept of purpose. And the fact that there's this perception that a purpose is one big thing that everyone in the company, feels driven by. But to your point, and I podcasted a high school basketball coach a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how he knew there was a kid on his team that was incredibly talented, but misbehaved all the time and played up. He would shine brilliance and then vanish. And he got into the car with this kid and he said, "Hey kid," I can't remember his name. "Hey John, what is it, man? Like what drives you? Like you're a talented kid, but why do you keep disrupting?" He goes, "What do you really want?" And he goes, "I just want to be an NBA player." And he said from that moment that everything that this kid did, he just said, if you want to be an NBA player, you can't do that. If you want to be an NBA player, that's not how they behave. And all of a sudden this kid shone, right? And he connected with his why. All of a sudden he could connect the action to his purpose. And I think that it feels to me that's such a massive missed opportunity in the corporate space where we fabricate this collective purpose and this collective why, but really that's our job. And we all have our own whys. So, I mean, that sounds like a phenomenal methodology and experience for people to go through. And because you do it collectively, God, what an experience that is, rather than, hey, what's your KPI for the next quarter?
Right.
Right. And have your KPI linked to that KPI.
That's right. I mean, it's such, you're making such an important point. And the thing that struck me is good on the kid that he was able to articulate it, because I think sometimes what happens is we as senior leaders get into these positions and we don't really know our why, right? We don't really, or we adopt somebody else's why or the company's why or what have you. And you're speaking to something so critically important is understanding my purpose, my reason for being here on this planet, my superpower, what I'm good at, right? Like starting to unearth some of those things and what really drives an individual is so important. But I actually think that kid has got a leg up on some of our senior leaders, because we'll hear things like, make some money, make sure the company is successful. But ultimately, I think there's something deeper there, and being able to excavate and unearth and figure out what that thing is actually so critically important, frankly, not only for the individual, but also, again, wish companies, we're just in business for altruistic reasons, but they're not, because ultimately, if I can understand your purpose and how that might ladder up to our purpose, it then helps all of us. If I am, I will never forget, it was the day after 9/11. It was actually 2 days after 9/11. And I was in Westchester, New York, and all my meetings, of course, had been canceled, but also all the flights had been canceled as well. And I was living in Raleigh, North Carolina at the time. And so I called up Hertz and said, hey, I'm not going to bring the car back to LaGuardia, which I couldn't get to anyway. I'm going to drive it back down to Raleigh. And they said, no problem. So I was rolling my bag down the hallway to get into my rental car and drive back to Raleigh. And I came across a housekeeper vacuuming the floor. And she stopped me and she spoke to me and said, well, where are you headed? And I said, I'm heading back to Raleigh, North Carolina today. And she said, she grabbed my hand, like she took my hand off my suitcase that I was rolling down, and she held my hands in her hands. And she said, may God bless you on your journey, and may God bless our entire country. And I mean, that was a long time ago now, but I remember that exactly. Now, I don't know what that woman would say her purpose was, but to me, it was connection and being human and making things better for other people, because she certainly made it better for me that day. And it was nowhere in her employee handbook that said, after a large national disaster, make sure you bless people. I'm sure they probably said, please don't talk about God in her handbook, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not a God person necessarily. But I will always remember that somehow she had tapped into what was most important to her and made a dramatic impact on me as a hotel, as a person staying at the hotel. And that is purpose.
And maybe it's as simple as that. I mean, maybe in this world where our consciousness is being sucked away into data and digital, and maybe it's as simple as practicing in that kind of
being human,
cognitive behavioral therapy, where you've got to make something conscious before it becomes a habit. And maybe the secret is, well, I just need to do something today that it's like humanizing. I need to actually find the time to connect with my team on something that isn't the work.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I think that so many people are so, I'm going to put it in air quotes, busy, that they don't slow down enough to have that connection and create that heart-to-heart, human-to-human thing that actually is the most important thing, whether at work or at home or in community or wherever. That connection with another person, to go back to our first initial conversation, is actually the thing that makes the world go round. It ultimately makes us more healthy as humans.
It's so true. I mean, I have this weird thing. My kids are like, think I'm a freak for it a little bit, but every single person I walk past on a street, I say, hello, how's your day? Every time I go through a checkout or do someone in a service role, I say, hey, thank you so much. Even if they're miserable, it's like, hey, thank you so much for helping me today. I really appreciate your service. A lot of the time you get nothing back, right? A lot of the time It's like someone will walk past, ride my bike around Park City and ride past other and give them a wave and most, but I just feel like, just imagine if no one ever does that to me. I rarely have someone walk past me and acknowledge my existence. But I feel like that's kind of a newish thing. I don't know. I feel like we used to do kind of more of that. Oh, look, sorry, I don't want to disappear off on a tangent here. We're coming towards the end of the podcast. Now, you talk about brilliance, and you've mentioned that word a few times throughout the podcast. But if someone felt like there's something there, right? Like, I think we innately feel there's more, or I'm more, or I can be more. Is that kind of what brilliance? You talk about finding your brilliance. What does that actually mean to the average Joe or Jane?
Yeah, it comes exactly back to the whole conversation we've been having. The way you tap into your own brilliance is by getting quiet and understanding what your authentic self is all about. So using my very simple example that I gave earlier, my authentic self wasn't just like, come in and check the numbers and do the report. That wasn't authentically me. or even in that example, you just come in and tell you how bad they suck. Like that wasn't authentically me, even though it was the case.
As if that's a motivator, just constantly telling people they suck, right?
Right? Exactly. Sometimes you have to, right? Sometimes that's part of your job. But the fact is the way to go about it, the way that you approach it, the ability to tap into the honesty, the authenticity, the truth of who you truly are is how you actually get to the brilliance. I don't get to the brilliance by putting round pegs in square holes. I get to the brilliance of people by helping them understand that I'm neither round nor square, but I am some weird shape we don't even have a word for yet. And that is the thing and my particular gift and how I can make a difference at work and life and community, et cetera. That's what the brilliance is about.
And I love it. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today. I just loved your energy. I mean, and you're so invested in this. You can see it spiritually as well as from a thought leader. How can people listening to this podcast, they're driving their car, they can't read the show notes. And by the way, all Anne's links are in the show notes. How can our listeners find you?
Yeah. So I also have a podcast, so that's a great place. So the Perfectly Imperfect Journey is my podcast. It's on a tiny bit of a sabbatical at the moment. We're taking a few months off, but we're hoping to pick it up here soon. DarshanLeadership.com is my website. Darshan means insight, light, or guide. So those are probably the two best ways. LinkedIn, I try to post a lot, some of my thought leadership there, and another great place to find me. So I'm so enjoyed my time. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here.
It was a pleasure. And if you just Google Anne, as I did, you will find plenty there. ANNEROBIE.
That's it.
And it was wonderful. I'm super grateful for you. I know we're all busy, and to have 45 minutes of your time today has been a blessing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.